What's going on, YouTube? We're back at it for another video, and today we've got a shadow damage Necromancer build to showcase that a lot of people haven't been talking about. This is one that's going to be rivaling with the bone builds. It's got massive damage output and in some moments maybe even more damage output than that of the bone build. Especially when it comes to the fact that we're not worrying about having massive or maximum essence at all times in order to get our maximum damage with this build. Anytime, as long as we're using corpse tendrils or bone storm on top of that, we're going to have the melting power we need to keep pushing on. And even in moments when we don't have essence, we still have the capability of dealing out a large amount of massive damage. That being said, we're going to jump into that skill tree, then the gear, and then go over to some gameplay footage to kind of showcase how to utilize this build in action. Going through some of the harder content, just showcasing how much power this build actually has. Now, first things first, with our basic skill, it's going to be up to your personal preference. Me personally, I'm using Reap, not only for the fact that we're getting damage reduction for 15% for 2 seconds as soon as we strike an enemy, but the biggest reason is the fact that the first enemy hit from Reap is actually going to spawn a corpse. Every 5 seconds this can occur, which is pretty quick, but the biggest reason is we can instantly get a corpse, so we can utilize corpse tendrils for this build, which is going to be huge for just increasing our critical strike chance and making some massive damage happen from every strike that we apply from that point going forward. But when it comes to facing off with something like a world boss, I would highly suggest Decompose. This is going to give us the capability of putting ourselves off at a distance and being able to utilize it for range. And on top of that, we can get a 10% flat increase to all of our damage output from utilizing Decompose when we're trying to gain that essence back. That's one of those personal preference moments. You could utilize this at any other point, but for me personally, it's going to work the best when it comes to facing off with the world boss. Any other time, you know, I have more issues than anything a lot of times with just trying to move when there's massive amounts of creatures on screen. You know, both of these basic attacks are eventually going to start striking in some manner, but at least with Reap, if I accidentally strike with it while I'm trying to move, I'm getting a 15% damage reduction. Whereas with Decompose, you're essentially just going to be a sitting duck and getting run over. But besides the point, one of the faulty moments when it comes to playing Necro, or just in general having a click to move, but having that click be the basic attack. Going on to the core skills, we've got Blight. This is going to be our main heavy hitter. This one and Corpse Explosion are going to be dealing a massive amount of damage. Now with Blight, one of the biggest reasons that we're going to be utilizing it is not only is it going to leave some defiled area that is going to be slowing targets by 25%, but at the same time, anything within that area is going to be having 15% more damage dealt to it. On top of that, there is a legendary aspect that pulls everything in, similar to that of Corpse Explosion or Corpse Tendrils, my goodness. That's going to pull us in even tighter, and just having that all on top of each other and at the same time being able to apply Corpse Explosion underneath that, we're just doubling, if not tripling our damage, and then quadrupling it, as we'll explain why that is once we get to Corpse Tendrils. But Blight is going to be a massive power play for us with this build. Going from that unliving energy, just one point of that, we don't need maximum essence increase for this build, but we do need imperfectly balanced, which is going to make our Blight actually cost 9% more, but trust me, it's like probably 2 or 3, I can't remember how much more essence per cast, but 15% increased damage to that. So at all times, Blight is going to be dealing 30% increased damage. Now, just under that, we've got Hewed Flesh. This is not something I would say in the very beginning you have to go for when it comes to leveling, but by the end point, you want this one for boss fights specifically. This is just going to be one of those moves where anytime that we deal damage, especially since we're dealing damage over time with a lot of our skills, this is going to help with just spawning those corpses in, and especially with that boss fight, there's no other way really besides Reap or Decompose to actually pump out some of those corpses. This is going to cause all the damage we deal to actually start pumping out corpses, and a lot of times there are moments where I've got Corpse Explosion and Blight going on a boss unit, especially if they're just kind of standing in it, a slow-moving boss. It is massive amounts of corpses, almost infinite, where I'm just able to spam it continuously, and it is one of those ways that we can actually melt some of those boss units really quickly. Moving on from that point, though, we're going to need Blood Mist. Sadly enough, Necro is one of those that has really poor mobility. This is probably the biggest con to this build, biggest con to the class in general. We don't have much when it comes to Unstoppable. We'll talk about some of that when it gets to the gear. But this is our only move to kind of get out of jail free card, and it's still going to be a 24-second cooldown. You're going to have to utilize this in certain manners, but at the same time, we can use this move to also deal a massive amount of damage, as we will be able to spawn corpses in with this, and with the legendary aspect, we'll be able to blow up those corpses as we go along. Sadly enough, the only way to reduce the cooldown on Blood Mist is overpowers. We can't guarantee that with the shadow damage, sadly enough. Occasionally we'll get it here and there, as every class has a 3% chance, but it's not going to be proccing all that often, so use this sparingly and wisely once we actually utilize it. Going on from there, Corpse Explosion, going to be another one of our heavy hitters, massive damage, not going to cost us any essence, and the biggest reason is Blighted Corpse Explosion, which is going to give us a vile explosion, what is it, a vile miasma? Got no idea. Basically another defiled area that's giving us 9,000 damage, 154% over 6 seconds. We're going to be able to basically get this up to 50k, or yeah, 50k a tick, plus it goes and ranges, sometimes it's 200,000. I mean, it just, with the critical strike damage increase that we'll be getting from some of these other skills, the damage is going to get outstanding, and it will stack per Corpse Explosion. Now, going down from there, we got Grim Harvest. This is going to help us with a little bit of that essence regeneration when it comes to the fact that we're utilizing Corpse Explosion a lot. Sadly, we did get a nerf recently. This used to be 9 essence at the max, but now it's 6. But trust me, you're going to be smooth sailing with this build. We're not going to need all that much when it comes to the corpse generation, as long as you're not just spamming the Blight continuously all the time. Should be good, but there are certain moments, even if you do spam, you'll be able to spam the Corpse Explosion and get that essence back. Now, right after that, we've got Fueled by Death. Now, me, luckily enough, on some of my gear, I have a +3 to this, but we will put 3 points into this to have 9% increased damage for 6 seconds after consuming any corpse, just overall increasing our damage. But going down from there, we're going to talk about Corpse Tendrils first. This is going to be one of the most damage increase abilities that we have for us right now. First, we'll talk about the fact that not only is it going to stun enemies for 3 seconds, but it's also going to slow the enemies pulled in, and then we're going to make them vulnerable for 3 seconds. These are things called damage buckets. Not only are we going to have crowd control, but we're going to create vulnerability, and we're going to create that stunning. And on top of this, with a legendary aspect, we'll be able to further increase our critical strike chance against everything that we deal damage to, and then anything that the damage is dealt by Corpse Tendrils increases its critical strike damage. But moving on from that point, we need 3 points into all darkness skills. We're going to gain, well, 2 out of 3 in the movement. I wish I could put a third one in this, but I believe I might actually need 1 more skill point. I'd strongly suggest trying to get this up to 3, but the biggest reason we want 3 in all of these is Gloom is going to give us 6% increased damage. This is going to stack up to 3 times for all of our darkness skills, so anytime that we're taking damage, we're actually going to be able to get 18% damage on all targets for at least 2 seconds at a time. Since we're dealing so much damage, this is always going to stack up to 3 times. Don't even worry about it. Then we have Terror, that not only are we going to get 9% increased damage to against slowed. Now think about the simple fact that Blight is also going to be slowing, so anytime that we're dealing damage with that, we've got a 9% increase. Anytime we're hitting with Corpse Tendrils, getting that slow from that, and at the same time with Corpse Tendrils, we've got that 9% additional bonus for them being stunned or immobilized. Now this is going to work also in tandem with Crippling Darkness. Now our lucky hit chance isn't the highest, but this does proc quite often since we have a lot of damage over time skills that are working with this, with any one of those shadow damages. But as soon as this does proc, having 3 seconds of that enemy being stunned and then just having another 9% increased damage is going to be massive, and we'll talk about why that gets even more deadly with some of the aspects we have on certain pieces of gear. Now, next to that, we have Necrotic Carapace. Now, this is just going to give us some Fortify by 2% anytime that we create a corpse. Now, this does proc based on hewed flesh, and we will get it through Reap. Sadly, that's the only way that we get it out of this, since it's only coming from skills. It's not coming from kills. Don't get that confused. Trust me, it is not going to be one of those massive, heavy fortifying abilities. We really have to create a lot of corpses through skills, which is only going to be done through the hewed flesh or Reap or Decompose, which sucks. And or we're also going to be getting it from Blood Mist as well. So that will be giving us a little bit of that fortify at the same time when we're using that, but that's why we don't put any more points into that than we already do. Moving down to our ultimate, we are going to go with Bone Storm. Now, I know this is a bone ability, but there is a legendary aspect that turns this into a shadow ability, so it further gives us that maximizing of damage, but at the same time, it's going to give us the capability of having a little bit more survivability with an increase in damage reduction, but at the same time, giving us a massive damage output. We will be getting a 20% critical strike chance increase from having Bone Storm active, so for 10 seconds, we're going to have 20% increase if we can top that off with our corpse tendrils. As you'll see, coming up with one of these legendary aspects, it's going to get a bit ridiculous when both of these are active at the same time. We'll be utilizing these against boss units and large packs of elites to basically eviscerate them within a second, if not 2. Or 2 seconds to 1. It gets ridiculous how much damage. But next to that, we've got standalone. We're not going to use any minions with this build, sadly enough. I did want to use the skeletal mages with this since they did have shadow damage and they did have the capability of stunning. But overall, they just were not something that was surviving all that often in order to spec them into this build. It just seemed a little bit too difficult to keep them alive at the same time, and it's going to cost us some of our skill slots. And what we have here is our best in survivability and our best when it comes to overall just damage output. But standalone is going to give us an 18% flat damage reduction from all targets. That's going to be perfect for us. And right next to that, we've got Memento Mori. Sacrificing both skeletal warriors and the skeletal mages increases their sacrifice bonuses by 60%. This may not seem like a whole lot, but when it comes to the first one we have for the skeletal warriors, which is a flat increase of 5% for our critical strike chance, it actually gives us another 3% on top of that, so it turns it into 8% critical strike chance. That's actually a massive increase when you think about it, and at the same time we'll be getting vulnerable damage and critical strike damage increase that does actually become quite substantial when you put in that 60% increase. But last but not least, we have got Shadow Blight. This is going to be a massive damage multiplier for us. This is going to be something that works with some of these legendary aspects that we'll be talking about with the gear that is going to create our overall massive damage output. Now with Shadow Damage, or Shadow Blight, Shadow damage infects the enemies for 2 seconds and gives us basically a 10% bonus damage to any enemy afflicted by that. And every 10th time that an enemy receives shadow damage from one of us, or basically any of our attacks, while they're afflicted by the Shadow Blight, they take an additional 2,000 damage for shadow damage. Now, it doesn't seem that much right here, but when it comes to the legendary aspects we're about to talk about, you'll start to see why this is actually the best skill for shadow damage, and it's going to give us massive damage output when it comes to overall every single shadow skill. But let's move on to that gear. Now when it comes to our gear, with our helmet, we're going to be utilizing Blood Mist, triggers corpse explosion on surrounding corpses, and we'll also be getting a little bit of cooldown reduction per corpse that we're actually detonating. One big thing about this is we can utilize this to either deal massive amount of damage or just deal some damage as we're trying to get out of one of those hairy situations. Say we need to just use Blood Mist to get outside of a pack and start moving in a different direction away from them. This is going to be one of those moments where we'll be able to create basically a line of damage through these corpse explosions, since we have the blighted areas on the ground that they'll move through and cause damage as they're pushing towards us. It's going to give us a little bit more survivability in certain moments, as since they're going to be moving along that path, we will be able to kill some of them and kind of reduce the threat that we have coming towards us in that moment. Now, when it comes to the aspects that you want to roll on a helmet, you can never go wrong with cooldown reduction, maximum life, and intelligence. Sadly enough, I do have 40% lightning resistance on this. The big reason that I say sadly enough on this is that there is a soft cap when it comes to elemental resistances. So sometimes you can be better off with getting different aspects, especially on your armor, than resistances to certain elements, as at a certain point when it comes to late game, rings and amulets are going to give us basically all the resistance we need, especially through not only their main stat, but at the same time through the gems that we can socket on them. And as you'll notice over here, generally there is a soft cap with resistances, so at a certain point when you have too much resistance, it actually is not benefiting you at all. As you notice with my fire resistance right here at 53.2%, I've got 51% on the boots, I've got 27 on the, or on the chest piece. I've also got another 35 on the ring and 25 from resist all with the amulet. You notice that's still sitting there at 53%. So I'd say about 40 to 50% is where you want to kind of have that resistance sitting. You don't really want to put it on your armor. And if you do, you might as well just roll it off at some point. As we get later into the higher levels, you're generally going to be doing better off with having something that's damage reduction, total armor increase, or overall just fortify, or something that just further increases your damage output, if not just essence regeneration or gaining more essence. That's going to be going a lot better than resistances on some of these armor pieces, so keep that in mind. And moving on to our chest piece, which has way too much resistance on it. Trust me, we're going to have to change this out, and a good rule of thumb to live by when it comes to leveling and gaining different gear. Anytime that you've got about 5 to 8 levels above your gear, it's time to start looking for a replacement, because not only is it going to be further increasing the item power, but each time the rolls that you're going to get when it comes to intelligence or percentages for damage reduction or damage are going to roll higher, and your overall armor is going to be higher. A lot of times you're not going to have an item that's going to last you forever. If you're still rolling through and you're 70 and you have level 50 gear on, you're going to notice it. Your survivability is probably going to be extremely low. You're going to have a hard time pushing through things. You may still have a massive damage output if you're one of the DPS classes and you have good legendary aspects on them, but when the gear overall is not able to actually perform its defensive nature alongside that damage output, you're going to be getting one shot all the time, and it's more than likely going to create a really bad experience for you. But with our chest piece, we've got 40 or 0.40% increased armor for 4 seconds when we deal any form of damage, stacking up to 40%. This is just going to be something that further increases our overall survivability, especially with 1, 2, or 3 levels above us. This really gives us some comfortability with taking some hits, being able to get into the mix with some of our enemies and just kind of get in there to get that close damage with corpse explosion, or just not worry about the fact that we can't really run away as necro since we have really terrible mobility. But on top of that, since we're dealing damage all the time, we're going to be able to maintain that 40% quite often. But when it comes to the aspects you'd like to roll on a chest piece, not the resistances we have here, always want to go with intelligence. That's always just going to be something that further increases our DPS overall. But anything that's close damage reduction, distance damage reduction is probably the number one, I'd say. If you can get that to roll on multiple pieces of gear, you can never go wrong with that. I don't know if you've had those moments where you faced off with those ghost archers, but the red ones, the green ones, or the teal ones, whichever, they're always extremely irritating, and they can be extremely deadly in large packs. So having that distant enemy damage reduction is a huge benefit. I would love to have that for me, because I'll tell you right now, they're the bane of my existence as a necro, since I can't really move all that fast, and they've got that aimbot, and they're just nailing me with 10,000 arrows. But anything to do with damage reduction or increase in maximum life or total armor is going to be a huge benefit for you, or anything that just further increases the generation of fortify as well, since we are getting a bit of that through creating the corpses. But moving on to the gloves. Now I have unique gloves on here, but this is one of those moments that's just kind of a cherry topper. You don't need these unique gloves to make this build work. You're still going to have great damage even if you don't have this. This is just going to further increase our overall damage output from corpse explosion and create it to be a volatile skeleton instead of immediately exploding that chases after or charges after some of our enemies. Sometimes it can be a bit wonky. Sometimes it doesn't actually work out for me. It actually ends up hurting me. But since we're constantly kind of clustering packs together through blight and corpse tendrils, it ends up working out 9 times out of 10, but that 10th time occasionally it just does run off into the distance. It doesn't really help us, but against those archers it can be extremely beneficial, since it runs after them and they want to kind of disperse and even themselves out. But if you don't have that unique gloves, we're not going to be using the aspect on this one. Aspect 4 gloves that would be great are Bone Storm, consumes up to 8 corpses, increasing its duration to a total of 8 seconds if you've got the max roll, just giving us 8 more seconds of that 20% increase to critical strike chance and 15% damage reduction. Another one that might be good would be Blood Mist, leaves a trail that lasts for 4 seconds, dealing shadow damage, just further increasing the damage output of our Blood Mist, since we'll be utilizing that. These are kind of ones that, you pop in and on if you were leveling. And there's also another aspect that I used while I was leveling that Each time that we consume a corpse further increases the percentage of damage for our core skill up to, with an amulet, a total of 75%. That's one to look out for. That could definitely increase Blight's damage overall after consuming about 5 corpses, just giving us a massive damage output from that, especially after utilizing it with one of the Paragon board's abilities as well. But those would be great aspects to throw in the gloves. But the aspects you want to roll on that: attack speed, critical strike chance, +3 rank to Blight, and intelligence. Those 4 are going to be the main ones you want. Biggest one is going to be critical strike chance and the +3 to Blight ranks. Those 2 are going to be the main heavy hitters. The other 2, you could have pretty much anything else on that, and it wouldn't be the worst thing, but you definitely would like to have the intelligence, no doubt. Attack speed doesn't really help us all that much with this build, but it can be beneficial in the long run, especially since I did get a low roll on that. But there are moments where I almost think that I should put this back on just to have that further increase of 10% critical strike chance, but that's what you'll be looking for when it comes to the gloves. Now, when it comes to our pants, we are working with the legendary aspect of each time that Bone Storm damages an enemy, we gain a barrier equal to 5% of our base life for 10 seconds. This does last after, or 10 seconds after that Bone Storm's complete. This actually makes me feel almost invincible at times. I can just really charge into packs of elites every time I save this Bone Storm for moments when I'm facing off with the boss, or I'm facing off with large packs of elites. If you've been through some of these dungeons, there's moments where it just seems like there's 5 different elites ready to pounce on you, and it just seems like some moments you can get one shot very easily or just dead really quickly with some of the different elements that they've got working with them, or modifiers on those elite units. But this is going to give us the strongest survivability in those moments, really be able to just charge in, get that damage output up, and just maintain that. We'll be able to close in, have a good amount of life, or barrier life. I don't know whether or not it stacks with the 5%, but I'm consistently seeing my entire health in that bubble of barrier, and I feel like it just almost never goes down. There's been a few times where I have died with it, but for the most part, this almost feels invulnerable with this active. I would say this is a must-have on the build for survivability overall. But when it comes to the aspects we want to roll for those pants, we want anything that's just damage reduction. Sadly enough, I do have dodge chance against close enemies. I wouldn't say you want that to roll on there, but as you'll notice, we've got a +4 rank to corpse explosion right here. These pants, probably not getting rid of them for a while. The only time I'm going to replace them is if I do find anything with that +4 rank to corpse explosion and just overall flat damage reduction from close enemies. And I wish that dodge chance could have been damage reduction from distance enemies. That would have just made these the perfect roll. But basically, you just want the further increase to ranks from corpse explosion and anything that has to do with just further damage reduction overall. Now, going from that point, moving to the boots, you'll notice that we have level 63 boots right here. They're very low, but the big reason is +4 rank to corpse tendrils. This is just going to further give us that ability to have that cooldown for corpse tendrils as low as possible, sitting around 8 seconds right now. With boots, arguably we'd love to have movement speed, but intelligence plus any rank to corpse tendrils and movement speed are the ones that you really want with this. +3 the max evade charges. That does help at times, but I'd much rather have movement speed than fire resistance on this. But I still haven't found another pair of boots that are equal to this where I can get the +4 to corpse tendrils, have the intelligence, and have movement speed. Been getting pretty unlucky with these, but I'll be looking for a replacement for these at some point. But thankfully for right now, this is working out in our favor. When it comes to boots, if you don't have the movement speed, if it's just further increasing your damage output, it's still going to be a benefit regardless of the level. It would just be bigger benefit to have further increase to that armor and overall just be able to move a bit more, especially with necro. So it's pretty slow. But the legendary aspect we've got on this is the blight defiled area. When spawn pulls in enemies around the infected area, we must have this one. It is just going to further give us the capability of really trapping those enemies within the corpse explosion area and the blighted area to further increase it by that 15%, give us the 25% slow for those enemies to give us that crowd control effect and just keep them trapped in certain moments. And you'll notice this thing kind of just mops people around in any direction. It does a much better job at pulling enemies in than corpse tendrils, and a lot of times I'll use it right after corpse tendrils to really pack them in and then pop the corpse explosion just to maximize the area of effect that we have with that damage over time from each of those skills. Moving on to our main weapon, we are always going to use a two-handed weapon for the simple fact of the legendary aspect for corpse tendrils. We gain 40% increase to our critical strike chance for 6 seconds every time we use this. Doesn't even matter if it hits an enemy. That's outstanding. I'm pretty sure every necro build is basically going to be using this legendary aspect. You just cannot go wrong with this, no matter what. This is a multiplier that is just amplifying any type of damage that we're utilizing, whether it's blood, whether it's shadow, whether it's bone. You just can't go wrong with utilizing this. And even in some cases, I'd say this might even be extremely beneficial for minion builds. But on top of that, we'll also be dealing 120% bonus critical strike damage to the enemies affected by corpse tendrils, which is just giving us a massive damage increase to any enemy that we'll be striking, and you'll notice that when we get into the gameplay footage. Now, when it comes to the rolls you want on the two-handed weapon, I'm kind of at a toss-up. When it comes to more survivability, you'd much rather use a two-handed scythe, as it's going to give us life on kill instead of the 52% critical strike damage increase. But if you're looking for maximum damage output, you want the two-handed sword that just gives us the critical strike damage as the main stat on the weapon. But below that, we're going to be looking for vulnerable damage, intelligence, crowd control, damage to crowd control enemies, critical strike damage every time, damage to stunned, damage to slowed, any one of those damage increases that's based around our crowd control or vulnerable damage. Critical strike damage is going to be a massive increase for us. Now, you could roll for damage to injured enemies, but with some of our paragon boards, we'll be further increasing our damage to injured enemies from that, and we can have that roll onto our rings and other aspects. It's not the biggest benefit to us. It does create a melting point as soon as we get them below 30% of their life, but we'd much rather have that just overall damage output for crowd control, critical strike, and vulnerable damage, and just further increasing our overall damage output from just flat intelligence increase. But moving on over to our amulet, this is going to be another one of the factors that really kind of pushes the shadow damage over the top. Sometimes I feel like this is one of those things that actually makes it more damaging than that of the bone build in certain moments. But with this aspect, we deal 180% increased damage for 6 seconds after Shadow Blight's key passive damages enemies 10 times. This is one of those that especially works extremely well when it comes to large packs. So say you've got one blighted pool that basically hit 10 enemies. Within 1 second, you've already increased your damage by 180% for the next 6 seconds. So every damage after that is just going to be a massive increase. And on top of that, every shadow damage or shadow skill that we're using is inflicting that shadow blight. So it's going to be very easy to get that 10 times pretty quickly. Now, against the boss unit, it can take a little bit of time, but at the same time, it's going to ramp up fairly quickly and we'll be able to melt them. Maybe not as fast as the bone builds in certain moments, but we're only a second or two behind them when it comes to this build. Now, this is one of those aspects that you can find from a dungeon, so if you're leveling early on, this is one that you can go for, and I'd highly suggest putting it on an amulet or on a two-handed weapon before you have the corpse tendrils increase. If you don't have or haven't found that one just yet, this could be something that benefits you, as sadly enough, when you craft the legendary aspect, it's going to be the lowest roll, so you're either getting 100% from the two-handed weapon or 75% from the amulet at the lowest roll until you find one for max roll. I've gotten lucky and found two of these at max roll, so I've got one sitting off to the side waiting for when I get that prime necklace for later on, and luckily I'm able to use this one for the time being until we get to the point where we have to replace it. Now, when it comes to the aspects you want on a necklace, overall damage output, a little bit of damage reduction, you can never go wrong with that, especially damage reduction from distant enemies. That one is like a must-have all the time. If you can get that on pretty much every or any piece of gear, as many pieces of gear as you can, it's going to be a huge benefit to you. But at the same time, we're getting damage reduction from enemies that are affected by shadow damage over time. Anytime that we're dealing damage to anything, we're getting that shadow blight on them, so we're getting a further damage reduction from that. And I did actually get +3 rank to the Fueled by Death passive. Sadly enough, I think amulets are the only one that can further increase ranks to passive points. I've only seen it roll on them Now that one's kind of a toss-up. You don't necessarily have to have the Fueled by Death or any specific passive to further increase. Arguably, if you've got something that just further increases the damage output or damage reduction, you might be better off utilizing that on an amulet instead of going with the increase to the passive. But if you got one that just further increases your damage, you still can't go wrong either way. It's kind of like a personal preference moment of whether you just need more survivability or you find one that has increase to something that's just giving you a little bit more of that damage output. But when it comes to the +3 for Fueled by Death, I don't really see it as something that's extremely noticeable, but it does just further increase our damage. Going forward though, for our first ring, obviously each one of these is going to give us just flat resistances at the top, but with the legendary aspect on this one, each time the Shadow Blight key passive deals damage to an enemy, it increases the next Shadow Blight's damage within 10 seconds by 24%, stacking up to 5 times. Sadly enough, I got the low roll on this one. This is one you have to find as well. You can't craft this one, but 5 times up to 40% could be another massive, almost 200% increase to damage. Or yeah, it would be at 40%, stacking up 5 times would be a 200% increase. Sadly enough, I've only found this twice. This one I found the first, and the second one is only about 2% higher than this one. Hasn't really dropped all that much for me, but if you can find this one, it is going to be a massive increase to our overall damage. I wouldn't say it's the biggest overall increase. This is something I'd like to test out a bit more if I had a max roll on it, but since we're always dealing that Shadow Blight, I keep it on there to just have more damage overall. It could be one of them though that you could just kind of trade off for something else for a bit more survivability or something for resource generation. That's something to talk about when it comes to, or that's something that could benefit you more. But it's based on your personal preference as to whether or not you feel you're getting enough resource or not. For me personally, I feel like I'm getting enough back, but if you feel like you need a bit more and you can take a little bit of a hit to your damage, that isn't the massive power play of the Shadow Blight 180% and the Corpse Tendrils, this is one I can say replace this for your resource regeneration skill or aspect. But when it comes to the aspects you want on the ring or affixes, you want anything that's just further increasing our overall damage. Damage to slow, damage to crowd control, damage to stun, shadow damage, and critical strike chance. You want both of your rings to have a roll of critical strike chance. No matter what, that is the number one you want, besides just further increase the damage overall. It's just going to make this build even better and just further increase the amount of damage output that we can deal, and guaranteeing us a lot more of those critical strikes as we go through. Moving on to the next ring though, we will want to have this legendary aspect. This is a guaranteed you want to have, as it's just going to give us more damage output when it comes to the Bone Storm. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does give us a little bit more damage overall from utilizing Bone Storm. Instead of it just being one that just swirls and deals the bone damage, it gives us the darkness attribute from it. Now Blood Wave may seem like it's dealing a lot of damage, but trust me, it is overall just something that's going to lay flat on the ground and just be something that just adds damage to us instead of multiplying our damage like Bone Storm does with its critical strike chance and giving us a little bit of that survivability with damage reduction. But when it comes to our other ring, again, more critical strike damage, damage to stunned enemies. I got damage to injured on here, but the big thing is critical strike chance on both your rings alongside all of that increased overall damage output that we've got. You just can't go wrong with that. Anything that's just crowd control damage, damage to stunned, critical strike damage, as long as it's got the critical strikes chance with it, you're going to be doing well with these rings. Now, when it comes to the Book of the Dead Skeletal Warriors, we're going to sacrifice 4 critical or 5% to our critical strike chance. Skeletal Mages, we're going to take the sacrifice on the cold for 15% increase to our vulnerable damage. And with Golems, we're going to take the iron for 30% increase to critical strike damage. Now, one thing to also talk about are the gems that will socket into our armor. We're going to want to go with the Topaz, as this is going to give us damage reduction while we're control impaired. One of the biggest downfalls for the Necromancer is that we don't have pretty much any skill to give us unstoppable. The only way that we're going to get the unstoppable is through a legendary aspect. From becoming injured while crowd control, we gain unstoppable for 4 seconds. This is one that you could throw onto one of your pieces of gear while you're leveling. I personally prefer having all of the attributes I have right now, but this could be something that could be extremely beneficial for us. But since we don't have that unstoppable, anytime that we get control impaired, having a massive increase to our damage reduction from this is something that's just going to give us that massive survivability increase. Trust me, when you get frozen, when you get slowed, when you get stunned, any of these moments we're basically sitting ducks. So if we can have another 50% damage reduction for those moments, it's going to be extremely beneficial. You're going to notice it. And in some moments, being slowed can actually be something that creates even more survivability based on the fact that we have this massive amount of damage reduction from just being control impaired. But you're going to survive being frozen and stunned a whole lot more, especially with those 1 to 3 level hires that you may be facing off with. You know, once you get up into facing off with 10 levels higher than yourself, that's when it gets to be something that it's still noticeable, but trust me, there's still going to be moments where it's going to be a quick melt, even if with all this damage reduction from control impaired. But within your level range, this is going to create that comfortability, so you won't be dying as many times when it comes to getting frozen or stunned. A lot of times you'll be able to move out of that and still be able to deal some damage. And since we're dealing damage over time, there are going to be a lot of moments where we'll actually be able to kill at the same time that we're frozen, stunned, or any moment like that. Now, when it comes to the gem and our main weapon, we're going to be utilizing the Sapphire. We're going to get that critical strike damage to crowd-controlled enemies, since most of the time with Corpse Tendrils, we're going to be hitting them with that slow, we're going to be hitting them with that stun, and at the same time with Blight, we're dealing that slow damage as soon as they're within that field. So no matter what, we're going to have a lot more crowd control on the enemies than we are getting vulnerable damage. You could go with the Amethyst as well, giving us 8% more to that damage over time. But it's such a lower number, and since we're utilizing everything on critical strike chance with this build and further increasing our critical strike damage, this is something that's just going to give us that massively more damage output from that. Now, moving on from that point, we're going to go over into the Paragon board. We're going to kind of make this a little bit quick, as the number one legendary node you want to go for first is going to be Flesh Eater. I went with the Wither first, but with Wither, our shadow damage over time effects are going to have a 5% chance to deal 50% more bonus damage, and this goes up based on 50 willpower each time. It's a bit, it's kind of like a gamble number for a bit more damage when it comes to the bonus, which isn't that great, but with this board we'll get more shadow damage overall, so I'd highly suggest going for this second. But first, the Flesh Eater. That way, consuming 5 corpses, we grant 40% increase to our damage for 6 seconds. This is going to be a massive damage increase in the beginning as you're leveling past 50. That's something you definitely want to go for first, and we'll also be getting more critical strike damage and damage to injured enemies along with that, and damage to elites, and you'll be able to quickly just kind of move up, as the rest of the board isn't that great. I wouldn't say you really want to go for it. You're really going for just the 40% increase and the damage to elites and injured enemies and critical strike damage. Along with that, with the glyph sockets, you definitely want to go for anything that just increases our shadow damage over time, and crowd control. Since we're utilizing a lot of slow with this, a lot of stun, it's just going to further amplify our damage over time. These things are just going to be massive increases for us when it comes to our damage output. That being said, that's everything to do with the gear. Let's jump straight over into that gameplay now and showcase how to play this build. Now, getting into the gameplay, you'll notice we'll be accompanied by the floating lightning golem turret over here, which is probably one of the more frustrating of the aspects in the Nightmare dungeons, but we're rocking through at tier 32 right here. All enemies 10 levels higher than us right now, just trying to showcase the raw power of this build and how much damage it can actually output, and the decent survivability it comes with. Now, there's still a lot of danger when it comes to this level. It may seem like I'm not taking too much damage, but I can still get one shot very easily by that rock or by some of those corpses with the spiders in them. As soon as they die, they'll explode. If I'm right next to them, yeah, it's definitely very easy for me to get one shot by that, and that's what made it so frustrating to actually have to go through this one with that floating golem turd. Unreal. But essentially, what we're doing with this build is, as you'll notice right here, is a good example for our Bone Storm. As soon as we see a large pack of elites, we hit Bone Storm, then we immediately hit Corpse Tendrils, and then we're actually able to move in with Blood Mist in order to effectively evenly distribute a bunch of different Corpse Explosions throughout that. And then we can turn around and just throw Blight to kind of condense them on top of it. But effectively, the method is roll in with Reap, hit at least one enemy, get that one corpse going, so that way we can pop off with Corpse Tendrils, pull everything together, and then I like to throw in a Blight to just further condense them, and then start popping the Corpse Explosion on top of that. Now, sometimes we may not have the essence to get that done if we're moving from pack to pack, so in those moments it may be easier for you to utilize the Corpse Explosion right after. We're still going to get a massive amount of damage, we just won't be able to tighten up that group as much from that Corpse Tendrils. Sometimes it works better than other moments. Sometimes Corpse Tendrils barely move some of these enemies, especially those ghosts. Unbelievable. They just seem to like to stay in spot, or some of those shamans with the rattlers. Nightmare creatures, I'll tell you right now, absolutely frustrating. But going forward from that, the big thing with this build is the simple fact that we're not really having to maintain maximum essence. We're always capable of dealing damage. We're leaning into the maximum amount of damage for a Corpse Explosion as well. Blight and Corpse Explosion are virtually dealing about the same amount of damage. Blight in some moments is just having more critical strike damage from it, in my opinion, and it just has the stronger capability of just giving us that 15% more damage each time that any one of the units is inside of that, along with having the 25% slow. So we got a bit of that crowd control with it at the same time. If only there was a legendary aspect that gave us some type of slow effect with the Corpse Explosion, that would just make it 10 times more powerful in my opinion. But that's why I roll with the shadow damage. I much prefer it to the bone build. It just seems more even for me, you know, even if I make a mistake or if I get below 50 of my essence, I'm not feeling like I'm just a wet pool noodle just kind of whacking things and irritating them instead of actually killing them and having to regain from that moment. Instead, I'm just able to move in. As long as I've got Corpse Tendrils up every 8 seconds, I can just pop that. I can roll in and have massive damage no matter what I'm dealing with, whether it be a Corpse Explosion or whether it be the Blight aspect or the Blight core skill. But you'll notice it's quite the melting power. You'll want to kind of move in as close as you can. I messed up right there. I should have gone in a little bit deeper. As you'll notice, we'll have some of those shielded enemies right here. They could definitely make things last a bit longer. And sadly, with Necro, you know, lack of mobility here. And we need some type of patch in the future to just kind of give us something when it comes to mobility, since we don't have anything that stops with or comes with unstoppable or anything that's just really further increasing our overall mobility in general. The most you've got is every time you're dealing some darkness damage, you're getting that 15% at maximum. And even then, it's so short-lived that it's just not helping us in the overall gameplay. I mean, 9 times out of 10, if I'm going to speed run something that's like tier 25, it's essentially going to take the same amount of time as it would take me for this tier 32 because of the fact of how slow I'm walking through everything. It's just unreal. I've seen some people say they've got speed runs with some of those bone skills and things along those natures with that. What must have been like 6 minutes or something. You got a good dungeon, and we all know it. Now, 10 minutes may seem pretty quick for a lot of people, and maybe that is a good speed run, but I've seen some people just kind of jet through things. You know, those sorcerers just teleporting through the whole thing. If at some point we could just get Bone or Blood Mist to have some type of shadow capability of making it into a teleport or something, that would just, you know, I could get rid of the fact that it would give me complete immunity for multiple seconds, or the fact that it could give me corpses, you know, change it over to a shadow to I can just kind of like jet away like a wind, some type of dash almost. That's just much more than the dodge we have right now, and it'd probably work out a whole lot better. But yeah, we definitely got messed up with the bone walls in this moment. And whew, that rock just keeps coming closer. Non-stop frustration with this one. But you'll notice that Corpse Tendrils has a massive radius, very generous for us. I wasn't sure if it was actually going to get the elite unit in that moment. But you'll notice that the rock actually can block our attacks. I really can't stand that. Like if we're throwing blight and that rock's in front of the enemy, it will actually stop on the rock. Absolutely frustrating, especially when we're trying to loot. But many times that you'll, one thing to actually note in that moment, you notice that I was just popping some of those corpse explosions. That's to get the stacks up. You'll notice down there there's a little orange circle that has a 4 next to it. That's going to be the one that amplifies our damage by 40% from the paragon board. But at the same time, we can just keep popping those corpse explosions to get that maximum essence before we go into our next fight. You'll notice that a lot of times essence is not the issue I have here. As long as you're using it generously or using it sparingly and kind of just only using blight when you need it to kind of group up and just kind of really focusing in on those moments when you need to capitalize on that damage and utilizing corpse explosion a majority of the time, because blight's just going to be the thing that just further amplifies that damage that you can throw on top of it after utilizing corpse or corpse tendrils. Goodness, we keep going back and forth here. Corpse explosion, corpse tendrils. Waxing and waning. Goodness. But moving on, we're finally getting to the point where we're heading on over to the boss unit. I mean, that spider's able to keep up this whole time, but you notice I get that loot itch right there. I've had so many times where chests have actually popped out a unique for me. Sadly enough, not this time around. But can't let it go untouched, before we go in. I'd rather die finding out whether or not I got a legendary or unique out of that instead of just letting it pass up and not having any loot to gather up. But you'll notice we're able to get it in massive damage really quickly in some of those moments, If I was capable of getting the corpse tendrils a little bit stronger in that moment to group everything up, or if the blight was able to actually pull them in a bit closer, that probably could have been one of those moments where just a couple of corpse explosions would have just stacked up so much damage to where it melted within 1 second. But not always are we going to have the capability of having those moments. When you have just 1 or 2 enemies, it really is a moment where you can showcase how strong that 180% is from those 10 enemies hit from the Shadow Blight. Waiting on that stack is sometimes the one thing that just kind of makes the build look a bit weaker, but trust me, by the time that 180 is in there, it is melting everything as fast as it possibly can, and most of the time, clearing packs is going to be the easiest way, or easiest thing for this build, but at the same time still has the melting power for bosses. Oh man. Now we're about to face off with the boss unit. Now we got a bit unlucky with this boss unit where we're basically, not only do we have this rock on us, but at the same time it's going to be, I forget the name of it, but it's the spider boss, that strong mobility one. A lot of times you won't have these boss units moving as fast as this one does. Generally be in one spot from time to time, if not like slowly floating around or slowly moving around, which works out really well for this build. When we have these high mobility bosses, this brood guard, it gets to be a bit frustrating at how many times it just runs away from our damage. You'll notice we're kind of chunking away at it, but we're not able to really capitalize on it just yet, as it just constantly keeps moving around. Plus, we're getting stuck kind of moving around the rock, trying to get an angle from that. Spider webs are going out, getting us stuck in there. Constant frustration just kind of moving us around. But lucky enough, right after this, I was able to go into a tier 33 on the same map and get to this boss again, showcase how quick or how much faster we can actually melt this boss unit, even though they do have strong mobility. Because one of the hardest things about this is the simple fact that we do want this unit to get hit by the corpse tendrils. Even if it doesn't get hit, sure, we do get the 40% increase to critical strike chance, but we want that amplified 120% increase to the critical strike damage to really be able to chunk away at the damage of this boss unit. Now, lucky enough, we were able to still get it done pretty quickly, but that rock wasn't making it too easy, and it's even kind of hounding my loot right here, keeping me from getting that. Let's jump over into that next boss fight over here at tier 33. Waited, we got our bone storm up, we're able to get in there, get the corpse tendrils going. We've got that massive damage increase right here. I'm missing with blight left and right, bit frustrating, but you'll notice we're able to get a bit more of that damage in a bit quicker on this one. But here is going to be that chunking moment right here. We were just able to really get him, sit him in that one moment in that damage over time and just absolutely melt it. That's when we're critting for like the 3 million, 4 million. I mean, that is one of those massive moments where we've got the Bone Storm, we've got the, what is it? The Corpse Tendrils, and all of that critical strike all the way up to the maximum. But that's going to be the end of it, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully this has helped you out when it comes to a necro build. You know, maybe you're tired of constantly dealing with the hassle of the bone skills and you want something that's a little bit fresh, a little bit different, and just giving you a different type of playstyle compared to that of the bones, but with similar gear to where you could transfer over pretty easily. This is something that's kind of great about it when it comes to certain aspects of this build, is it is pretty similar to that of what you see with a lot of those bone builds out there. So transferring over isn't going to be a hard one at all. Just looking for a few different key aspects to just kind of make this shine is what you're going to be looking for. But we've got plenty of those builds coming up in the future. If you enjoyed this content, obviously hit that link down in the description. Follow me over at Twitch if you want to check some of this live. If you want to see more content like this in the future, hit that subscribe button. We've got a bunch of different builds to come with the Necro, including the Minion's Thorn build. We've got the Blood Zoo build. We're going to be working with the Bone builds. I'm going to be trying to play around with Bone Spirit and some PvP builds. And after that, we're going to be working with the Druid, the Sorcerer, Rogue, and the Barb. Going to be working on all sorts of builds in the coming future. So if you'd like to see more of that, hit that subscribe button. But on that note, have a good one.